Thanks for downloading the McKay interview. My guest today is Diccon Bewes, best-selling author, travel writer, chocolate lover and Englishman in Bern. We talk, among other things, about Switzerland's successful political model of direct democracy, about the origins of Swiss tourism and the real Thomas Cook, and why Swiss trains drive on the left. Yes, haven't you ever wondered why? You think you know a lot about Switzerland? Listen to Diccon and be surprised. I hope you enjoy the show. Hello everyone. Today I have a literary theme to pursue, a Swiss-British literary theme, and I'm delighted to have as my guest to help me the very talented writer Diccon Bewes. We're sitting comfortably in the very friendly Warwick Geneva Hotel, having just finished a delicious British Swiss Chamber of Commerce lunch, at which my guest was the guest of honour and speaker. Welcome to the McKay interview, Diccon.
Thanks so much for having me.
It's good to see you. Good to see you again, and good to have you in Geneva. Diccon, you're a talent, and a very productive and industrious talent too. 7 books written, at least, Swiss Watching, #1 bestseller in Switzerland, and a Financial Times Book of the Year, over 175,000 copies sold, also in French, German and Chinese. Articles about Switzerland have been published in the Financial Times, The Guardian, The Times, The Telegraph, British Airways High Life, Luxus Magazine and Die Zeit. 10 years a bookseller at Stauffacher in Bern and Waterstones in London, 2 years at The Lonely Planet, a senior writer I read at Holiday Witch, an inspector for publications such as Witch Hotel Guide, Witch Guide to Tourist Attractions, and entertaining and a much sought-after public speaker on TEDx, BBC Radio, Swiss Radio, TV, DRS, Switzerland Tourism, and it goes on and on. It's really very impressive. The way you write, Diccon, and talk about Switzerland and the fact of your Swiss naturalization tells anyone who has met you that you've fallen in love with this country. Why? What is it that appeals to you?
Well, I always like to say it was the chocolate that brought me here, because it's so much better than anywhere else in the world, of course. But no, I came because my partner is Swiss, and we got bored of living in separate countries. We did see each other often. It's only an hour's flight. In American terms, we had a very close distance relationship, of course, but in European terms, we didn't. And so that was the main reason for me coming. But once I got here, I realized that I loved the scenery. I loved the work-life balance here. Work is taken very seriously, but so is life. So shops are still closed on Sunday, for instance. People generally take time for themselves. And I like that. I think in Britain, especially, I lived in London 17 years, that balance has disappeared a little bit. Especially with the onset of emails and text messages, you're kind of expected as an employee to be available all the time, wherever you are. And here it's not quite as bad, maybe because some people think Switzerland's a little bit behind the times. But I think it's quite important that people enjoy their life but enjoy their work as well. And I love both aspects of that.
I think it's true what you said. I've lived here probably longer than you. But I noticed also that desire for privacy and separation is much more prevalent than, say, in the UK, where when I go back, every day seems exactly the same.
Yes, and it is a culture shock for some people, and some people never quite get used to the fact that on Sunday you actually have to relax because the shops are not open, even out-of-town superstores are not open. But certainly if you work in retail, it's refreshing. You don't have to work on a Sunday, as I didn't have to in Bern for 6 years. But also you take the time for yourself, whether that's with family and friends or just switching off and going for a hike in the beautiful countryside.
And is your attachment to one particular part of the country?
Well, I have to say Bern, of course.
Okay.
No, Bern is my home. It's been my home for 16 years. And now that I've seen almost every corner of the country and stayed in every city and have friends everywhere, I still do love Bern. I think it's that perfect combination of being small enough you can find a life there. It's not too intimidating and daunting. But it's large enough, partly because it's the capital, that there is enough going on. It's 130,000 people. Now, a city with 130,000 people in Britain wouldn't have nearly as much going on as Bern does. We're helped by the fact there are lots of embassies and government departments.
Yeah, sure.
But the cultural life is much, much better than any small city I've lived in or been to in Britain, so that we have street theatre and we have carnival, we have an opera house. And it's just close to the mountains. Within an hour you can be skiing in the winter or hiking in the summer. So I love that combination of small city, big countryside, and quality of life.
And is it true, what I've heard, that it's the only sort of capital city or largely that hasn't got its own airport?
It used to have an airport. It
Yeah.
used to have an airport, and Swiss actually flew from there to various places. It's a small airport in Belp, just outside Bern. The trouble with it is it can't take jet planes. It's only propeller planes. So the budget airlines aren't interested at all, although in their terms it would be an ideal destination, small airport, easy access to the mountains. There are still charter flights from there, but they're mainly holiday destinations during the summer. I used to fly from Bern to London. It was really easy. Bern, London City, check in 20 minutes, and literally the terminal building, you just walk out and you get on the plane. But that's a long time ago now.
I didn't know that, okay. Diccon, I've had many people on my show to whom I put this same question. Why is Switzerland successful? By all logic, with all its diversity, it shouldn't be a success, but it is. What's your theory on its success?
My theory is that it's based on how Switzerland started. And Switzerland has never had a king or an emperor. It's never had one person in control or even one party or one movement or one religion or one language. It's a country that shouldn't really exist, as you say. And it began with the first 3 cantons standing up to the bad guys, who in those days were the Austrians. For many Swiss, they're still the Austrians, so they're still the bad guys.
They're the people they like to beat at skiing.
Yes, yeah. And at everything, actually. And so it began as a contradiction in terms, really. And in German, the Swiss say they are a Willensnation, which is they are country simply because they want to be a country. It is a sense of will. It never had an independence war like the Americans or a unification campaign like the Italians. And so there's, from the very beginning, it's a sense of community, whether that's your community, your canton, or your country, and this feeling that it's literally a country and government by the people, for the people, of the people. And so I think that's really fundamental in the story of the Swiss success, is they want to do it for themselves, not for a king or a president. They want to do it for themselves. In my very first book, Swiss Watching, I liken Switzerland to a beehive, where everyone's roughly equal, the queen aside, and they all work together for a greater good. Now, that sounds a bit utopian, and obviously Switzerland is not utopia. It is not perfect at all. But I think that very beginning shows how the Swiss mentality works. It's like we are stronger together. And the way the political system works, I think, is very instrumental in Swiss modern-day success, because it's unique in that no one party or person ever has control of anything. It's very disparate, not only on a federal level, so that the cantons are all equal, but also within the federal parliament and government itself. You can never get a situation like you do in France or Britain or America, where one party is in control and every 4 years you chop and change. There is a sense of stability here for the greater good. So the president, the head of state, is actually a council of 7 people from 4 different parties. So it's always about finding consensus and cooperation. Obviously, there is confrontation. But I think the overriding aspect of Swiss life, across all aspects of it, is we are better when we work together rather than against each other. And I think that's a very bottom-up way of looking at politics and the economy, but it works, and Switzerland shows it works.
Because you know the place very well, give us some insights into how the system deals with, I wouldn't say conflict, but very strong disagreement. How is consensus managed so that it can't become glacially slow? Progress doesn't become glacially slow.
Well, you could argue that progress here is glacially slow. Women didn't get the vote till 1971, which is horrendously late in European terms. But I think the way it's managed is, first of all, you have an electoral system, a version of proportional representation, which means that in Parliament you have 11 parties. And even the largest 11 parties.
Gosh.
So even the largest party, which in German is called the Swiss People's Party, and in French is the UDC, they only have 26% of the votes, 26% of the seats. And so even though they're the largest party and they are the populist right-wing party, they were populist before Trump was even around, they don't have control of anything. They need at least 2 other parties to pass legislation because of the breakdown of parties. And so that means that even at their most extreme, and some people would argue that they are quite extreme, they can't get anything through Parliament unless they work with at least two other parties. Now that's another centre-right party, the FDP, the Liberals, and then one of the centre parties. If you look at the other end of the spectrum, you have the Greens and the Social Democrats. Again, even if they work together, they can't pass legislation. They need a third party. And so whether it's extreme left or extreme right, they are never in control of the agenda. They always have to find a compromise. The way they can try and control the agenda is through the referendum system, direct democracy. So we have votes on anything and everything, whether it's should cows keep their horns or should Muslim minarets be banned. It can be anything. But again, the people decide on it. It's a national one-man, one-vote system. But it doesn't automatically become law. Parliament still has to enact whatever is decided. So again, the search for compromise is always there, whether it's trying to persuade the majority of the people to vote for you or trying to persuade the majority of Parliament to vote for you.
And just give some insights, particularly for those listeners who are not living here and listening to us. Is there a thing called voter fatigue here? I mean, if you have so many referendums in Switzerland, is the percentage of turnout in any way representative?
Generally not. I'm honestly surprised. I became Swiss last year, and so I've now voted a few times. It's every 3 months. And it can be national votes or cantonal votes or even communal votes. It depends on the issue. So some have quite low turnout if people aren't excited. But generally, it's around 50%. I mean, it's about the same turnout as most other democracies.
As much as that, 50%.
And when it's a big issue like immigration or abolishing the army or joining the United Nations, then it's around 70 plus.
Okay,
so the highest ever turnout is 73%, which puts most other countries to shame.
Okay. Today my guest is Diccon Bewes, the celebrated author, travel writer and chocolate lover. Now, Diccon, we all know that the British had a big hand in inventing winter sports here, going back to the 19th century. Now, you've studied and written about the long relationship between the United Kingdom and Switzerland. Share with me some insights. What stands out in that relationship between Britain and Switzerland?
For me, it's a couple of things which I researched because I'm a travel writer, so I'm interested in the history of tourism. One is that in 1863, Thomas Cook created the first ever package tour to bring people to Switzerland.
So this is the Thomas Cook.
The Thomas Cook, who was a real person even before he became a travel agent. And he became a travel agent in Britain doing day trips and things. It didn't quite work, and so he looked further afield, and he chose Switzerland. It was then sort of idealized as this beautiful, unindustrial country that Byron had written about, that Turner had painted. And he brought
Mary Shelley was here.
Mary Shelley was here. Yeah. Dickens wrote Dombey and Son here. Robert Louis Stevenson wrote Treasure Island here. And so he organized a group to come by train, which had then just reached Geneva, and it was the birth of modern tourism. It was so successful, within 10 years he had invented traveller's checks, invented rail passes, was selling round-the-world tickets. And all of that was with British middle-class lawyers and doctors and teachers who, for the first time, didn't own land, so didn't have endless amounts of time off, but weren't working every day because they weren't in a factory, and they wanted to go on holiday. And it was the beginning of what became the foreign holiday.
Leisure time.
Yes, and that started here in Switzerland. And it changed Switzerland very quickly because Switzerland in those days was quite poor. People lived off the land or worked in factories. And then suddenly this influx of British tourists, and they came very quickly. The first year he brought 500 people, the second year he brought 2,000, the third year he brought 10,000.
10,000 people came with him, my goodness me.
Because it was cheap and easy in those terms. Before Thomas Cook, you needed 2 weeks to get here by coach and horses, and you needed money. You had to be Byron or Dickens. He enabled a 2-week foreign holiday, and so people came in their thousands. And so the trains had to be built, the hotels had to be built. People found jobs as chambermaids or barkeepers, souvenir sellers, tour guides. So a lot of the rural population in Switzerland, which was the poorest part of Switzerland, suddenly found employment because the British wanted to see exactly that. They wanted to see the mountains and the glaciers that we don't have in Britain in the same way. So that's one of the big contributions Britain has made. Linked to that is the fact that the Swiss train system was designed by a British person because the Swiss could not agree on building trains. The cantons, when trains started in the 1830s, there was no federal government in Switzerland. The cantons couldn't agree on who should build them, who should pay for them, who should give up the land for them. So basically they just didn't build any. And then in 1848 we have the first federal government. One of their first priorities was, let's have a train network to link the country together.
That's an important milestone,
yes,
in many ways.
Well, yes, and the important milestone was 2 years later, 1850 and 1852, the Railways Act, and they invited Robert Stephenson, who was the son of George Stephenson, the main man for train travel. He invented Stephenson's rocket in Darlington. His son was invited here by the Swiss government. We were experts in train travel in those days. Yes. I know it's hard to believe, and he designed the train network. And he designed it linking Lake Constance with Lake Geneva and linking Basel with the mountains.
So right across the country?
Right across the country.
It's a grand project.
With a changeover point in Alton. And if you go to Alton today, if you go to platform 12, it's still the changeover point. And platform 12, there's a zero marker marking the 0 point of all Swiss railways. And it's also why Swiss trains drive on the left like in Britain, not on the right like in Germany. It is a British system. And when it comes to winter sports, it's a famous anecdote. How true it is, no one really knows, but those first tourists came in 1863. 1 year later, in Graubünden in St. Moritz, the owner of Bad Ruth's Palace had his British guests in the summer, and he wanted a way to get them to come in winter because winter was a dead season. Downhill skiing, as we know it, hadn't been invented. That also was a British invention with Arnold Lunn in Muren in the 1920s. Skiing up until that point was very practical to get you from A to B in the snow and not as a sport. So he said to his British guests, this is Johann Badrut, said, if you come back at Christmas, if you don't like it, then I will pay all your costs for getting here. If you do like it, you can stay until Easter for free.
It's quite a deal.
Quite a deal. It's win-win for the British tourists. Of course, they came back. Of course, they loved it, and they stayed till Christmas, and winter tourism was born.
It's a lovely story.
Yeah, and also we brought with us things like curling as a way of occupying in the days before skiing. And up until the First World War, winter became a huge part of the tourist season, which didn't exist in other countries. And without skiing, because that was post-war or interwar, you had hotels being very creative of how to entertain their British tourists, and they nearly were all British. So in Grindelwald, for instance, the main resort in the Bernese Oberland, every hotel had its own ice rink, every single hotel. And they would have orchestras on the ice rink to play music while the people skated. You would have sort of Olympic games on the ice rinks where people would have to do a three-legged race but tied together on ice skates. So the hotels knew how important the British market was and basically invented winter sports to cater for them.
Fascinating. Have you ever flipped the coin, Diccon, and looked at into the contribution that the Swiss, small as their population is, have made to the United Kingdom?
Yes, and I have discovered that ice cream, or gelato, was introduced to Britain by a man from Ticino. Now, I discovered this from the Swiss embassy in Britain. Obviously, they're very proud of this fact. His name was Carlo Gatti, and he was born in Ticino, so spoke Italian. And he went to Britain in 1847, and he is credited with bringing the art of making gelato, rather than just frozen cream, to Britain and starting off the whole ice cream craze that took over Victorian Britain. And so that was one great contribution. The other, of course, is that there's a tube station named Swiss Cottage, so we have to remember that, as always.
I spoke to Alexander Fasel, who was the Swiss ambassador in London, about that, and he says it now has a connection with Bavarian beer, apparently. But
yes, and originally it was just a house, and in the late Victorian time, early Edwardian time, Britain went through a phase of copying different architectural styles. It was a house built in the chalet style, and it just stuck.
It's a lovely story.
Yes, it's now a pub. But no, it's a lovely story.
Something quite different now, Diccon, and maybe, again, people who are listening to this who are not based here may not quite understand what I'm getting at, but you can explain. You're a good example, in my opinion, of integration. Tell me how you see the efforts the Swiss have made towards social cohesion. It's a big thing here. Have you had good and not so good experiences in this social cohesion experience? Be honest with me on that one.
Yes, I've had very good in that. I think it helps, if I'm very honest, that I'm white and ostensibly Christian and speak an understandable language. That's English, by the way, in case you hadn't guessed. And so for me, and also my partner is Swiss, so I was sort of thrown in at the deep end. I didn't have to find my way in the way that other foreigners do. So for me, at the beginning, it wasn't a huge challenge, but I also noticed that the Swiss are very keen that people learn the language, that start to integrate and to feel part of the community. It goes back to that community spirit. You pay tax here, even if you're not Swiss. You can't vote, but you still have to know the recycling rules or know the building ordinance in your building, so whether your laundry is closed on a Sunday and things like that. So to some people it can feel like there are lots of rules and it's a bit control freakery, but I actually quite like that because you know where you stand and you know how things work. But even me as a acceptable immigrant, in inverted commas, as soon as my first book was published, I've had hate mail. I've been told to leave the country. I've been told I'm an embarrassment both to Britain and to Switzerland. We've had to call the police one time because someone was threatening me. So you cannot please everyone all the time. And I think that strand of things has got worse with the advent of social media. And there are lots of other famous examples. Oprah Winfrey coming and being refused service in a Zurich handbag shop, and she said it was because she was black, and so she walked out.
I remember that story, yeah.
Again, Switzerland isn't perfect. It does try hard, but you have to remember also, and I always remind myself of this, Switzerland has no history of empire or of immigrants from anywhere other than Europe.
There's no baggage in that respect, like the British.
So there's no
French,
baggage, but there's also
yeah.
no sort of, so that's a good thing, but the bad thing is there's no sort of history of dealing with others. And the others, whether they're Muslims or black people or gay people or whatever, have to find their own way to fit in with Swiss society rather than Swiss society fitting in with them.
No, well, this interview is not about me, but it's enough to say that my family and I have had our experiences here. We lived in the German-speaking part and Geneva, which is much friendlier because it's so international.
Yes, and I think it's just a question of exposure and expectation. And so in Britain, I grew up in a small town, but like every small town in Britain, you had an Indian restaurant, a Chinese restaurant. And small towns in Switzerland, up until recently, the most exotic thing they had was a pizza place. So I think it's just your background and what you're used to. And Britain's had a head start in that because we've had the empire and decades of immigration, and Switzerland is a few years behind.
No, that's a good answer, I think. Diccon, you live in Bern.
Thank goodness.
Give me some examples of your observations of the differences, even tensions from time to time, between town and country in this varied country. I know from my own observations, having lived here even longer than you, that this is real. This variation, this tension between town and country, particularly at times of local and national votes. What do you have to say about that?
I think it is real, and especially in a big canton like Bern, which has a lot of rural areas. It's the second largest canton. But Bern itself, the city, is very much a red-green coalition the last 25 years, very much a liberal bastion, whereas the countryside is the heartland of the Swiss People's Party. So you have that tension. I would have to say you have that in most countries. You look at the electoral map of Britain or America, and you pretty much always see that the main cities are in left-wing hands and the rural areas are in right-wing hands. I think the difference here is, as you point out, in other countries you only see that difference once every 4 years. Here you see it once every few months when we have a contentious referendum, a little bit like the referendum we had earlier this year to validate the law that had passed through Parliament controlling CO2 emissions. Now, everyone thought it would pass because we all know that the climate is changing, even though some people refuse to accept it, and the glaciers are melting, and it's a big issue for Switzerland. But it failed. And there are lots of theories as to why it failed after 7 years of negotiation in Parliament to get that compromise through.
And it failed by a fair margin, too.
In Swiss terms, a fair margin, yes.
Exactly. Yeah.
And one of the main reasons was that most of the rural areas voted against it. It was, unfortunately, at the same time as other more controversial referendums dealing with farming practices and things like that. And so the rural vote was brought out in a way that it may not have been at any other time, but it is what it is. The CO2 law failed, and so now Parliament has to start again. So you do see various divides in Switzerland, which are the same as any other country, regional divides or town and country, or between working class and middle class, or between old and young. The same as in any other country, but they're more obvious because they're more often.
It's interesting in what you say. Dickon, this is a slightly trivial question, except to say that neither you nor I are trivial in our love of chocolate. And I'm partial to cheese too. You put this on your website. But tell me, Dickon, why these two food items are held in such a special place in the minds and on the palates of the Swiss, chocolate and cheese?
I think it's obviously the thing that links them is milk. And you need milk to make cheese, you need milk to make milk chocolate. And the Swiss have lots of cows. And so it sort of seems like it's fairly obvious as to why the Swiss are linked to both, but it actually isn't. If we start with chocolate, there are no cocoa trees in Switzerland. I always point that out. So there's no reason why Switzerland should be a chocolate nation, but it's because milk chocolate was invented here in 1875 in Vevey, and it became synonymous with Switzerland. And Switzerland has always been very good at this, importing raw materials, making something of higher value and exporting it. In the 19th century it was chocolate, these days it's coffee. So Switzerland, in value terms, is the second highest exporter of coffee in the world after Brazil, but in value terms.
But that's
because they import coffee beans and make Nespresso and Nescafe and export it.
And because the domestic market is so small.
Yes,
yeah.
And they did the same with chocolate in the 19th century. With cheese, it's slightly different. It's because cheese is a way of making sure that milk doesn't go off and spoil. So when you live in small farming communities in the mountains, which are cut off 6 months of the year because of the snow, you turn your milk from your bountiful cows into cheese as a way of preserving it and using it and not wasting it, but also as a way of providing consistent food throughout the winter.
This is very practical. Dickon,
Yes.
It's been great fun talking to you, and I've learned a lot, as I knew I would. Many thanks for making time for me, and I hope that you sell lots more books.
Me too.
Before the end of the year. And my guest today has been Diccon Bewes, author, travel writer, chocolate lover, and Englishman in Bern. Dickon, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for listening. Please share the show with those around you, and if you have any questions or feedback, write to me at contact@mackays.ch. I promise that I will reply to you.